Captain and Mrs. Irby then nurtured me. They taught me the Bible. They taught me leadership skills, so that they were having me teach littler children in Sunday school when I was, 12, 13, 14 years old. And that was a thrill for me, because I always, even at that young age, I had a love for children, younger than myself, and through them, I've realized I had a calling to be what they were. I wanted to be a Salvation Army officer, and that became my overriding goal. They encouraged me. I spoke at youth conference. They were called youth councils, and because I was, even then as a youngster, I was fairly adept public speaker. I took a leadership part at church, and so I became known within our division of the Salvation Army as a young person with leadership ability, and I was invited to do things at conferences, and that was another very powerful experience for me. And so when they were, I mentioned earlier that they came, my mom was never very interested at all in what my accomplishments, but when I graduated from Salinas High School, Captain and Mrs. Irby came to all of the functions. They came to the baccalaureate. At that time there was a baccalaureate service. They came to the honors assembly. I was graduated number 12 and 780 some students, and they were very proud of my accomplishment. I was awarded a scholarship, and I was a seal bearer. I was acknowledged for a number of accomplishments at the awards assembly. My mom didn't come. Captain and Mrs. Irby did. And so it was very, they enabled me to grow into someone who felt I had something to give. And so when I was, by the time I was 16, I was leading the youth group, and Captain and Mrs. Irby were always there, standing behind, but we had all kinds of programs going on. My younger brother, his name was Paul, I always called him Pete, so you have to excuse all the nicknames. But Pete and his girlfriend were king and queen of the Valentine banquet that I arranged, that we had there for the youth group at the Salvation Army. And so there are a lot of really good memories about the Salvation Army. At one time, when I was an older teenager, the core building was at the corner of San Luis. Now it's a two-story building across from where the library used to be. San Luis went this way, and then, so the Salvation Army core building was at that location at one time, but it eventually moved into what was then a much nicer facility on East Market Street, and that was where many of the events that were significant to me and my religious experience within the Salvation Army took place. The last I saw that building, it was the door store. It was an electric, garage door facility there on East Market. But every time I pass it, I still remember the good times when I was with Captain and Mrs. Irby there.
Now we'd have to backtrack. You were telling me some really interesting things about Salinas High School.
Yes.
And your time there, and how many students were there, and how you felt like a family, or at least...
Absolutely. Yeah, it was. And I started at Salinas High School in 1956, graduated in the spring of '59, because it was the 3 years. We went to 9th grade. Our freshman year was actually part of junior high school. And at that time in Salinas, there was only Salinas Union High School, and they had to change the name when North Salinas High School opened, because it wasn't Union anymore. But at that time, it really, Salinas Union High School was a very good name for it because there was no other high school that I'm aware of within 50 miles. And so everybody, no matter what neighborhood you grew up in, no matter what ethnicity you might be, or what your socioeconomic situation was, everybody went to the same high school. And it was a melting pot in the truest American sense of a melting pot. We were all together. And we very soon, didn't matter which elementary or junior high school we came from, my very best friend through high school happened to be someone that I met. We were in all the same classes in our sophomore year, and so we kept looking at each other, and we almost had to become friends because we just ended up in the same group. She was from Gonzales and had done all of her schooling up to that time in Gonzales. And so when we all ended up together at Salinas Union High School, we became a wonderfully unified student body. And we were all Salinas Cowboys. And we sang the song and we went to the football games. There was nothing else going on Friday nights because, at least in the beginning of high school, we didn't drive. Eventually, yes, we would drag Maine, and there was a Mel's Diner, and yes, the car hops. It's been a while since they used roller skates. And I mean, so you look back on American Graffiti, the movie, and if you've lived it, you remember, it would really happen. That wasn't something that Spielberg or whoever it was it he? Anyway, they didn't make that up. It was real. And so at Salinas High School, I believe we had a kinship with each other that maybe is missing in our cities now, where you're have an allegiance to your neighborhood and to your school. There are 5 or 6 high schools right in Salinas now, let alone outlying areas that all have their own high schools too. And I'm not saying it was better, this is worse, I'm not saying that, but I do know that there was a sense of community at Salinas Union High School, and we met each other seemingly on equal terms, and we were more maybe interested in differences. They didn't seem to separate us, but it was, if somebody was different, we were interested in what they knew that maybe we didn't, where they came from that maybe we hadn't been. And so I loved high school, and I would be totally remiss. We'll get to the fact that I've written a book that takes place here in Salinas. I have a whole chapter on Peter McLennan was my high school English teacher. I say in the book, there were no trivial moments with Mr. McLennan. Of course, English was the area in which I always felt I felt proficient. I felt I can do this. And he was my English teacher. And so part of it was maybe the subject itself, but there's never been a teacher like Mr. McLennan was. He was a retired Presbyterian minister, so teaching was a second career to him, and doggone, Mary Jean, he was old. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because I'm a lot older now than Mr. McLennan was when I had him for English. He was probably 55 or 60. And so here he was with all this life experience and with all his wisdom, and he mined us. He went after whatever we had to offer. And there were no advanced placement classes then, but a group of us were kept together. A group of us who might end up in a higher level of certain subjects. And that group was Mr. McLennan's little clan. We were his, and he I went from, Black Beauty and whatever else I had found at the library to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and the great questions. And he never thought we were too immature or not ready for any of these great ideas that he introduced us to. And I don't know what an impact he may have had on some of the other students, but for me, it was life-changing. He's the first person who ever said to me, we wrote an essay every week, and most of the kids were, oh my God, again? I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And so on one essay, I wish I remembered now what the subject was, but when he gave it back, he said, you have the ability to make people feel what you write. That is rare indeed. I still get goosebumps. And eventually, I wrote a column for the North County News when I was married. We lived in Prunedale, and our two boys went to school out there. I told my husband when we bought that little fixer-upper in Prunedale, standing in front of that house, and I don't want to get out of the camera, but I'm standing in front of that house, and I said, we're not moving. We're staying. My children, Mary Jean, I knew what it felt like to be, in and out of all kinds. You never know anybody. You're always looking for a friend. They were born to that house. They graduated high school from that house. They went to college from that house. We gave them roots, and I mean that was what I didn't have when I was growing up. But Mr. McLennan and Salinas High School were, my mom couldn't move us out of the school district. It was, she had to go a long ways to do that.
Yeah.
And so Mr. McLennan was another one of those teachers. When he met me, he said, you must be Dave's younger sister. And there was that affinity because Buzz and I were very much alike. He wrote, I wrote. And we came by that skill. I didn't know anything about my father's family until it was a few years ago that a cousin called me, introduced herself. Genealogy is so much easier now on the internet. And she's related to me through my dad's family, and they owned newspapers, they were writers. And so whatever my brother, Buzz does not know that because his contact came after he died, but I learned from Thana Cottrell, a cousin in Florida, that my father's family came from people who wrote and had that ability. His mother, my dad's mother, my grandmother wrote poetry, and so did my dad in his own way. And so it's fun for me to identify with that talent, that whatever Buzz and I had in the way of linguistics and verbal expression came from my dad's side of the family. Because my mom, I knew it didn't come from my mom, but I had no place to, I had no idea of my dad's background. So it was fun to realize that that's where that came from. And Mr. McLennan nurtured it. And then, as I mentioned a little earlier, the North County News was the read in North County at the time. The daily paper is important, but the weekly paper, you keep it and you read every word of it, and it's got I wrote the column of the local happenings and interviewed children, and it was and so from there, whatever other kinds of writing that I did, I kept journals and all of that. And that came from the influence that Mr. McLennan had. When I married, I'd been out of high school for 5 years. And when you're 23, 5 years seems like a long time. The notice was in the newspaper, and I got a note from Mr. McLennan. And he said, I read about your marriage. You are one of my happiest memories of my teaching experience. You and your brother were the ones that got it and loved it. He wrote me the sweetest note. And so, Mr. McLennan, I would love for him to know that eventually I did write a book because he was so encouraging of that kind of thing. Mr. Spittler at Salinas High School was another one of my favorite teachers, and I found him about 10 years ago, and then I lost track of him too, because if they were in their 50s in 1950, there's very little chance that any of those people are going to be around now, and it would have been fun to give the first copy of my book to Mr. McLennan, because it's because of people like that.
Yes, it meant a lot. I would like to talk about your writing further, but I do want to go back to dragging Maine and the drag races, and that was such a wonderful story.
Yeah, Mary Jean, thank you, because that really is a fun thing for me to remember too. My brother Dave Umbaugh and his friend Clarence Mendes, and a lot of the names are lost to me now, but Buzz and Clarence Mendes and some of the other guys, they got together and chartered a drag strip at the Salinas airport. And that was kind of a big deal for a bunch of kids that were in high school or just barely out of high school, and got a drag strip going. And that was what we did on Saturdays. And later on Sundays too, I think. I don't remember for sure. I went to church on Sunday. I couldn't have been. But anyway, so that was the culture in those days. I mean, we sat on the front lawn at Salinas High School, and the kids that had cars drove by. They dragged Main Street during the lunch hour. I mean, it was a car culture. I mean, this was the 50s, and those were very cool cars. I remember, it just sprung into I remember the Edsel. And we looked at that, even us, because we were used to the look of, the Ford Fairlane, big, long, with the wings in the Cadillac, and the Chevys, even the little boxy Chevys from the 50s. Very cool looking. I think they should have asked the teenagers at that time before they floated the Edsel, because we knew inherently it wasn't going to happen. But dragging Maine and then going to the drag strip and actually, drag racing. When we drug Maine, this is another sign of the times, because now, and probably for good reasons, dragging is against the law. It just tied up the street too much. But in those days, we had Officer Parker from the Salinas Police Department was our ombuds person. He rode a tricycle, he rode a three-wheel motorcycle, and he was part of our group. He was a part of what was going on, and if anybody had a problem, Officer Parker would facilitate whatever. And there was a Mills drive-in, and the car hops roller skated, and a cherry Coke or a suicide Coke had all the different syrups in it. I mean, everybody could afford it. I mean, it wasn't like it was you could be a very cheap date when all you had to do was gasoline was 25 cents a gallon, and a cherry Coke, and they didn't kick us out if we didn't order more than that. Typically, if we were actually going to eat, we would go down the block to A&W. They had car service too, and that was not very nice to Mel's. But somehow or other, the hamburgers at the A&W were better. And there was one other drive-in in town at the time, and it was Sal's out in the Alisal area. And there was, by the time we were going to Hartnell, and that was more of a hangout for Jerry Hosford. He's singer-songwriter, and he was a kind of a rougher kind of guy on purpose, and his crowd hung out there. And so I went to school with Jerry, good old Jerry, and he still does shows. I don't know where he is right now. But so that was our culture at the time. Very naive times in one way. Everybody was our friend. We didn't have to worry about meanness in the way our children have to worry about it now. It was good. There's probably no other word for it. We were innocent to some extent, naive, but Salinas was a hometown. Wherever we were in Salinas, we felt at home.